Have you ever had that uncomfortable feeling that you've started to see things in people that you simply didn't notice before, and now you can't unsee them? As if, suddenly, the masks have fallen, and what's left underneath isn't exactly pleasant? Maybe you're picking up on subtle signs, looks that don't match the words, actions that contradict what's being said, hidden intentions behind seemingly innocent gestures. And the strangest part is that this doesn't bring you relief, it brings a certain weight. A sense of distance. A different kind of loneliness. Because the more you see, the less you seem to fit in. And here's the part almost no one tells you: this doesn't mean the world suddenly got worse, it means your perception has changed. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." And what may be happening to you is exactly that, a psychological awakening. A rise in awareness. An expansion of your ability to read people beyond the surface. But this kind of awareness comes at a cost. Because when you start seeing beyond the persona, the social version everyone presents, you inevitably come into contact with the shadow, both in others and within yourself. And that changes everything. Conversations start to feel too shallow. Relationships begin to feel forced. Some connections simply lose their meaning. You begin to notice patterns: manipulation disguised as affection, interest masked as friendship, ego hidden behind humility. And the most unsettling part, you realize that many people aren't even aware they're behaving this way. This creates a quiet internal conflict. On one hand, you want to keep seeing the best in people. On the other, something inside you can no longer ignore what's right there, obvious, even if no one else seems to notice. It's as if you've crossed an invisible line, and there's no way back. And maybe right now, you're asking yourself, is this good or bad? Because this kind of clarity doesn't come with lightness. It comes with questions. With a certain sense of isolation. With the feeling that you're seeing a game that others don't even realize they're playing. But what if I told you this isn't the end of anything, but the beginning of something much deeper? Because seeing people as they really are isn't just about them, it's about you. About the level of awareness you're accessing. About the kind of reality you're starting to perceive. And this is exactly where most people get lost, because they don't understand what's happening inside them. But before we go any further, let me ask you something quickly. If this kind of content has ever made you think differently, if at any point you felt like this describes something you're going through, leave a like on this video. It helps this message reach more people who are also going through this silent awakening. And tell me in the comments, have you ever felt like you're seeing things that others simply ignore? And if you want to keep exploring this kind of deep understanding of human behavior, perception, and awareness, subscribe to the channel, because what you're about to understand might completely change how you see people, and yourself. Because what feels like clarity, might actually be just the first layer of something far more complex that you haven't yet realized. And maybe what's most confusing for you right now, isn't even what you're seeing in others, but what it's awakening inside you. Because the more you see, the more you distance yourself from who you used to be. And that creates a strange feeling, as if you're evolving, but at the same time isolating. Carl Jung spoke a lot about this process of individuation, this solitary path where you begin to become who you truly are, even if that means no longer fitting into the same places, the same conversations, the same people. And this is exactly where many people get stuck, because seeing too much can be uncomfortable, but ignoring it is no longer possible. So if at any moment during this video you feel that click, that sense of, this is exactly what I'm going through, I want to make you a simple but important invitation. Leave a like on the video, not just to support it, but because it helps this kind of content reach others who are also going through this same silent awakening. And tell me in the comments, honestly, have you ever felt like you're seeing something in people that no one else seems to notice? You can write something like, I started to see, or now it makes sense, because that not only reinforces this process within you, but also creates a connection with others who are in the same phase. And if you want to keep understanding more about human behavior, the shadow, perception, and this kind of awareness that changes everything, subscribe to the channel. Because what comes next isn't just about seeing others, it's about understanding why you've reached this point, and what it reveals about who you're becoming. There's a very specific moment in this process, a nearly imperceptible point, where you stop just feeling something is off and actually begin to recognize patterns. And this is where everything changes. Because before, you only had a vague sense, something didn't fit, an energy felt off, a discomfort you couldn't explain. But now, you begin to understand why. You notice that the person who always presents themselves as the victim is actually repeating the same cycle. You see that someone who talks about loyalty behaves in completely inconsistent ways when no one is watching. You start to recognize the ego hidden behind false humility, the neediness disguised as control, the insecurity masked as superiority. And the most unsettling part is that you start seeing all of this with too much clarity. It's no longer just an impression, it's a pattern. It's no longer a maybe, it's almost automatic reading. And that completely changes the way you relate to the world. Because once you start seeing beyond the surface, you also lose the ability to pretend you didn't see it. Carl Jung said, "What you resist persists, and what you accept transforms." But there's a detail here that few people realize: when you start seeing the shadow in others, it's impossible not to start recognizing parts of it within yourself too. And that's exactly what makes this process so intense. Because it's not just about figuring people out, it's about realizing that you also participated, at some level, in these dynamics. Maybe you ignored signs. Maybe you accepted less than you deserved. Maybe you adapted too much, just to maintain a connection that, deep down, no longer made sense. And when this awareness arrives, it doesn't come gently. It comes with a certain shock. A quiet discomfort. A breaking of illusions you didn't even realize you had created. And it brings up a question that echoes in your mind: how did I not see this before? But that question hides something deeper. It's not that you didn't see, it's that you weren't ready to see. There's a level of perception that only activates when you step out of autopilot. When you stop reacting emotionally on autopilot and begin to observe. And that observation is the beginning of real self-awareness. Not the superficial kind with ready-made phrases, but the kind that requires the courage to face what lies beneath appearances. And that's why, the more you see, the more out of place you feel. Because most people are still living within those superficial layers. They're still attached to the persona, that version built to be accepted, to avoid rejection, to maintain control. And when you begin to see beyond that, you naturally disconnect from that game. Not because you want to pull away, but because you simply can't participate in the same way anymore. Conversations begin to feel empty. Certain behaviors become predictable. Some relationships lose their meaning, not because you stopped caring, but because now you understand what's really happening there. And that can be lonely. Because while you're noticing patterns, intentions, energy, many people around you are still operating at the same level as before. And that creates a mismatch. A feeling that you're on a different, internal rhythm, as if you're seeing a layer of reality that isn't shared by everyone. But here's something that might unsettle you even more. This clarity can also begin to distance you from who you used to be. You start questioning your past actions. Re-evaluating decisions. Seeing where you abandoned yourself, where you deceived yourself, where you accepted what you shouldn't have. And that can create guilt, or even frustration with yourself. But this phase is inevitable. Because every expansion of awareness comes with a breakdown of identity. You're not just seeing the world differently, you're no longer being the version of yourself that accepted that world without questioning it. And that creates a strange inner space, as if you're between two versions of yourself. The old one, that no longer makes sense, and the new one, that is still forming. And it's in this space that many people try to go back. They try to ignore what they've seen. Try to fit in again. Try to pretend nothing has changed. But deep down, you know it has. And you know there's no going back to your previous level of unconsciousness. Because once you see, you can't unsee. And perhaps the most important thing to understand here is that this phase isn't about becoming cold, distant, or suspicious of everything. It's about developing discernment. It's about learning to distinguish what is real from what is projection, what is connection from what is dependency, what is truth from what is merely appearance. But before reaching that more balanced clarity, there's a confusing stage, where everything feels somewhat distorted. And it's exactly this stage that can make you doubt yourself, or even question whether seeing too much is really something positive. If any part of this describes exactly what you're going through right now, write a simple phrase in the comments: "I started to see." You don't need to explain much, that phrase alone carries a huge meaning for those who understand this process. But here's where things start to get even more confusing, because after that first moment of clarity, something unexpected happens: you begin to doubt your own perception. It's as if the same awareness that opened your eyes now starts questioning you all the time. Am I overreacting? Am I seeing problems where there are none? Or am I finally seeing what's always been there? This kind of doubt doesn't come by accident. It appears precisely because you've stepped out of autopilot, but haven't yet stabilized this new level of awareness. And that creates an unstable ground within you, where perception and insecurity begin to coexist. Carl Jung spoke about projection, the psychological mechanism in which we see in others what, in some way, also exists within us. And this is where many people get lost, because when you start noticing behaviors, intentions, and patterns in others, a part of you begins to wonder: is this really about them, or is it something in me being projected? And that doubt is powerful. Because it can make you more conscious, or completely paralyze you. You start analyzing everything. Every word, every gesture, every silence. What used to be a simple conversation, now becomes a field of interpretation. And that's exhausting. Because your mind no longer shuts off. Your perception no longer relaxes like it used to. And the most ironic part is that while you're trying to understand others more deeply, you begin to feel less understood than ever. Because you can no longer explain what you're seeing in simple terms. You try to share a perception, and people minimize it. You try to point out a pattern, and they say you're overthinking. You try to express discomfort, and hear that you're being too sensitive. And that's when the doubt grows even more. Because when your environment doesn't validate your perception, you start invalidating yourself. But there's a detail here that changes everything. Not all doubt is a sign of error. Sometimes, doubt is just the symptom of a mind transitioning from a superficial level into a deeper level of emotional, psychological, and energetic awareness. The problem is that, in this in-between phase, you don't yet have full clarity on how to interpret everything. You begin to notice inconsistencies, but you don't yet know whether they are real patterns or just isolated moments. You feel a strange energy, but you don't yet know whether it's intuition or a reaction based on past experiences. And that creates a constant state of inner confusion. Because you are between two worlds. The old world, where everything was simpler, more direct, more automatic, and this new world, where everything seems to have layers, hidden meanings, unspoken intentions. And the truth is, this transition is not comfortable. Because you don't fully trust your perception yet, but you can no longer ignore it. And perhaps the most important thing to understand here is that this phase is not a mistake in the process. It's part of it. It's as if your mind is recalibrating. Adjusting the way you read people, situations, emotions. And during this adjustment, noise is natural. But what makes this even more intense is the emotional impact. Because it's not just about understanding others better, it's also about feeling more deeply. You start noticing micro-expressions, tone shifts, subtle inconsistencies, and this triggers emotional responses within you. Sometimes you can't even explain why something bothered you, but it did. And that can generate anxiety. It can create distance. It can create a constant sense of alertness, as if you're always trying to decode your environment. And here's a question many people avoid asking. What if the problem isn't seeing too much, but not yet knowing what to do with what you see? Because perception without direction can turn into overload. You see more, feel more, understand more, but don't know how to filter, interpret, or act. And that can make you withdraw, distance yourself, or even become more distrustful than you'd like. But at the same time, there's something inside you that knows this isn't just an overreaction. There's a quiet sense that you're accessing a deeper layer of reality, even if you don't yet know how to handle it. And maybe that's exactly why you can't go back to who you were before. Because deep down, you feel that something important is happening within you, even if it still feels confusing. If you've ever found yourself in this conflict between trusting your perception and doubting it at the same time, comment one word: confusion. Not as something negative, but as a sign that you're in the middle of a real internal shift. And it's exactly at this point of confusion that something deeper begins to reveal itself, something not just in the people around you, but within the very structure of your mind. Because what you're experiencing isn't just a shift in perception, it's direct contact with what Carl Jung called the unconscious, especially the shadow. The shadow is not just the negative side of people, as many think. It is everything that has been repressed, denied, hidden, both in others and in yourself. And when you start seeing beyond the masks, what you're actually seeing are fragments of that shadow emerging through behaviors, micro-expressions, contradictions. And that completely changes how you interpret the world. Before, you saw isolated actions. Now, you begin to notice unconscious patterns. Before, you believed what was said. Now, you observe what is revealed behind what is said. It's as if you've developed a symbolic reading of people, a kind of emotional literacy that goes far beyond the obvious. But here's the part that can destabilize you. When you begin to see the shadow in others, you inevitably begin to recognize your own. And that is uncomfortable. Because it's no longer possible to hold on to the idea that I only attract people like this, or the problem is always the other person. Awareness starts to show that, somehow, there is resonance. An unconscious meeting point between you and what you perceive. This doesn't mean blame, but it does mean responsibility. Emotional responsibility. Responsibility for your level of awareness. Responsibility for what you choose to ignore, or confront. And this is where the process deepens. Because you begin to realize that many of the dynamics you saw externally have also existed within you at some point. Maybe in a different way, maybe at another level, maybe more subtly, but they existed. And this breaks a very common illusion, that seeing more puts you above others. In reality, the more you see, the more you understand that everyone is dealing with their own unconscious content. Some hide it better. Others project more. Others aren't even aware. But everyone, in some way, is influenced by what hasn't been integrated. And this awareness brings an intense duality. On one hand, you develop more empathy, because you understand that people are not just what they show. On the other, you also develop more discernment, because you realize not everything can be ignored in the name of understanding. And balancing those two is not simple. Because if you lean too much into empathy, you lose yourself. If you lean too much into judgment, you close yourself off. And it's exactly in this balance that a new way of seeing people begins to emerge. Not as good or bad, but as complex. Unconscious in some aspects, conscious in others. Capable of connection, but also of projection. And this changes your behavior. You start speaking less, and observing more. Reacting less, and interpreting more. Exposing yourself less, and choosing more carefully where and with whom you open up. Not out of fear, but out of awareness. And yet, at the same time, this can create a strange sense of emotional distance. Because the more you understand the mechanisms behind behaviors, the less you react impulsively. And that can make it seem like you're pulling away, when in reality, you're simply no longer engaging in the same way. And this is where many people get confused. They think they're becoming cold, when in reality, they're becoming conscious. They think they're isolating themselves, when in reality, they're filtering. They think they've lost connection, when in reality, they're beginning to see which connections are actually real. And this process is not quick. It requires time, observation, and, above all, courage. The courage to keep seeing, even when what you see is uncomfortable. The courage to recognize patterns, without falling into the trap of trying to control everything. The courage to look within, with the same depth you look outward. Because in the end, all of this is not just about seeing others as they really are. It's about beginning to see yourself without the distortions you've carried for so long. And maybe that's exactly why this process affects you so deeply. Because it's not just the world that is changing before your eyes. It's the way you position yourself within it. And the deeper this awareness goes, the more a new question begins to emerge, almost like an internal whisper you can no longer ignore. If I can now see all of this, what do I do with this awareness moving forward? If this reflection resonated with you on any level, comment one word: awareness. That's it. Because anyone going through this process understands the weight, and the power, of that word. And it's exactly when that question begins to echo within you, what do I do with this awareness? That the process stops being just perception, and starts demanding positioning. Because seeing changes everything, but not acting differently keeps you trapped in the same cycles, only now with more awareness of what's happening. And in a way, that can be even more uncomfortable. Because before, when you didn't see, you got involved, you gave yourself, you explained, you insisted, without fully recognizing the pattern. But now, you see. You recognize the behavior, the intention, the dynamic, and even so, sometimes, you still find yourself repeating it. And that's where a different kind of internal conflict is born. It's no longer about the other person, it's about you. Why, even seeing clearly, do you still hesitate to act differently? Why, even sensing the energy, do you still expose yourself? Why, even understanding the pattern, do you remain in certain situations? Carl Jung said, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And perhaps this is one of the hardest parts of the process, because it's not enough to see the shadow in others, you have to face what within you still responds to it. And that is not obvious. Sometimes what keeps you stuck is not the other person, but what that relationship activates within you. A need for validation, a fear of rejection, an old pattern of adapting to be accepted, an unconscious attempt to fix something that comes from long before. And until that is recognized, you continue connecting to the same dynamics, even if in different people. That's why, at times, it feels like you attract the same type of person. But maybe it's not about attraction, maybe it's about recognizing too late, or staying even after recognizing. And here is the turning point many people avoid. Because owning this requires a level of inner honesty that isn't always comfortable. It means stopping looking only outward, and starting to investigate what within you still sustains this kind of connection. And this isn't about blame. It's about power. Because the moment you understand that you are not just a spectator in these dynamics, you also understand that you can interrupt them. But interrupting isn't easy. It often means changing how you position yourself. Saying no where you used to give in. Walking away where you used to insist. Holding the discomfort of not meeting expectations, both others and your own. And that can feel lonely at first. Because you begin to realize that many of your connections were based on versions of yourself you no longer want to sustain. And when you change, those connections naturally transform, or fall apart. And that hurts. Not because you want to go back, but because part of you is still letting go of what was familiar for so long. But at the same time, something new begins to emerge. A more solid kind of clarity. A stronger sense of boundaries. A more balanced perception between feeling and interpreting. You begin to understand that seeing people as they really are doesn't mean rejecting everyone, it means choosing more consciously who you engage with, how far you go, and what you accept. And that completely changes your energy. You stop reacting automatically, and start responding with intention. You stop getting lost in the emotion of the moment, and begin to observe before acting. You stop adapting to fit, and start positioning yourself from who you truly are. And that inevitably changes how people interact with you. Some drift away, because they no longer have the same access. Others test your limits, to see if you're still the same person. And some, simply can no longer connect with this new version of you. And all of that is part of the process. Because you're not just seeing differently, you're becoming someone who no longer accepts what you once tolerated without question. And the more you sustain this new stance, the more you realize something important. Not everyone is ready to be truly seen. Because being seen beyond the persona, beyond the mask, beyond the social role, can be uncomfortable for those who haven't yet had the courage to look at themselves. And that's why, often, when you start seeing too much, people begin to distance themselves, or even react defensively. Not necessarily because of something you did, but because of what you perceive. And maybe that's exactly what starts to raise a new layer of doubt within you. If seeing all of this changes how people relate to me so much, how far is it worth continuing to see? If this part touched something you're still trying to understand within yourself, comment one word: boundary. Because deep down, everything starts to revolve around that, the moment you stop just perceiving, and start choosing. And it's precisely when you begin to hold these boundaries, when you stop adapting, over-explaining, accepting what you once tolerated, that something even deeper happens, and very few people are prepared for it. You begin to realize that seeing people as they really are doesn't just change your relationships, it changes how you are perceived. Because suddenly, you're no longer accessible to certain dynamics. You no longer react the same way. You don't engage in emotional games, don't respond with the same predictability, don't validate behaviors that once went unnoticed. And that breaks expectations. And when expectations are broken, people reveal even more of who they are. This is where your perception deepens almost inevitably. You begin to notice who respects your boundaries, and who tries to cross them. Who adjusts to your new stance, and who is bothered by it. Who approaches with authenticity, and who pulls away because they no longer find space for projection, manipulation, or unconscious games. And that can be, at the same time, liberating and lonely. Because the more conscious you become, the more selective you become. Not out of arrogance, but out of clarity. Not out of rejection, but out of discernment. But this phase has an important detail that almost no one talks about. It can make you feel like you're losing people. But maybe, you're just losing versions of relationships that only existed while you were someone you no longer are. Carl Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." And this process of becoming who you are, inevitably requires leaving behind everything that is not aligned with that more conscious version of you. And that includes people. But here's the shift that transforms everything. There comes a moment when you realize it's no longer about seeing others, it's about seeing the kind of reality you're willing to live. You begin to understand that you don't need to react to everything you perceive. You don't need to confront every inconsistency. You don't need to explain your perspective to those who aren't ready to see. You simply choose. You choose where to place your energy. You choose where to engage. You choose what to ignore, and what to consider. And that choice changes everything. Because when you stop trying to change what you see, and start adjusting how you position yourself in relation to it, your power returns to you. And that brings a different feeling. Quieter, but stronger. You begin to feel less affected by others' behavior, not because you stopped perceiving, but because you stopped engaging automatically. Your perception is still there, perhaps even sharper, but now there is a filter. An awareness that observes before reacting. And at this point, something begins to reorganize within you. That initial confusion starts to give way to a more stable clarity. That constant doubt begins to be replaced by a quieter confidence in your own perception. You no longer need to prove to anyone what you see. You simply know. And that inner certainty changes everything. Because you stop seeking external validation, and begin to trust what you feel, what you observe, what you understand. And that completely transforms how you move through the world. You become more present, more attentive, more conscious of your choices. And at the same time, more selective about what you allow into your emotional space. But along with this new clarity, an even deeper question arises. If you can now see all of this so clearly, what kind of life, relationships, and reality do you truly want to build from here? Because perceiving is only the beginning. Knowing how to choose is what truly transforms. And maybe this is exactly where a new phase begins, a phase where it's no longer enough to see, you have to decide what to do with it all. If this part resonated with you, comment one word, choice. Because in the end, everything starts to come down to that, the moment you stop just seeing, and start directing your own reality with awareness. There comes a moment in life when something shifts quietly, you begin to look at people and no longer see only what they show, but what they hide. And that can be deeply uncomfortable. Because seeing beyond the surface is not a light gift, it's a weight. And maybe that's exactly where you are right now. Carl Jung said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." And that's what's happening to you. You're not just seeing others more clearly, you're seeing what exists behind them, the masks, the unconscious patterns, the emotional games, the unspoken intentions. And that changes everything. Before, you might have accepted certain behaviors without question. You gave the benefit of the doubt. Ignored small signs. But now, you notice the tone behind the words, the discomfort hidden in a smile, the inconsistency between what someone says and what they actually do. And most unsettling of all, you begin to realize that many relationships around you are built more on need than on truth. This can create a strange sense of distance. As if suddenly you're in an environment where everyone continues acting the same, but you can no longer pretend you don't see. And that can make you feel alone even when surrounded by people. Because when you see too much, it's hard to go back to seeing less. But here's what few people understand, this phase is not about judgment, it's about awareness. There's a huge difference between seeing and condemning. And if you're not careful, this new perception can become a trap, the trap of placing yourself above others, of believing you're the only one who has awakened while everyone else is blind. And that's exactly where the most subtle psychological danger of this process lies. Because, according to Jung, everything we see in others also exists, in some way, within us. The so-called shadow is not just the dark side of others, it's also yours. So when you begin to identify manipulation, insecurity, falseness, or neediness in those around you, it's not just an external reading, it's also an internal invitation. An uncomfortable invitation, because it forces you to ask, where does this also exist in me? And maybe that's why this phase is so intense. It's not just about perceiving others, it's about beginning to perceive yourself more rawly. Without filters. Without easy justifications. Without the stories you used to tell yourself to stay protected. And here is where many people get stuck. Because it's easier to keep analyzing others than to look within. It's more comfortable to point out others' patterns than to recognize your own. But those who truly move through this process, understand that this awakening is not about superiority, it's about responsibility. Emotional responsibility. The responsibility not to repeat unconscious patterns. The responsibility to choose more consciously who you connect with, but also how you behave in those connections. And that completely changes how you live. You begin to realize that not every connection needs to be maintained. That not every energy deserves access to you. That not every bond needs to be deep just because it has existed for a long time. And at the same time, you realize that you also need to become someone more whole, more aligned, more authentic. Because it's not enough to see masks in others, while still wearing your own. And this is where something even deeper begins to reveal itself, because the more you see, the more a question begins to emerge, almost like a constant whisper in your mind. If I can now see who people really are, then who am I really, beneath everything that hasn't yet been confronted? And maybe that's the most uncomfortable question of all, because while you begin to see people as they truly are, another layer of reality starts to unfold, and this time, there's no looking away. Because it's no longer about others' behavior, it's about your own identity. You realize that, for a long time, you also constructed versions of yourself to fit in. Small adaptations. Small compromises. Small social masks that, at first, seemed harmless, but over time, began to distance you from who you truly are. And the strangest part is, you didn't even notice when it happened. Maybe you learned to be more agreeable than truthful. Or more silent than authentic. Maybe you said yes when you wanted to say no, just to maintain a connection that, deep down, no longer made sense. And now, with this new awareness, all of that starts to bother you. Because once you see, there's no going back. Carl Jung spoke about the process of individuation, this inner path where you stop being only what the world expects, and begin to become who you truly are. But this process is not as beautiful as it sounds in books. It's messy, lonely, and often painful. Because it requires you to let go of parts of yourself that aren't true, but were comfortable. And that's exactly why many people choose to stay asleep. Because awakening isn't just gaining clarity, it's losing illusions. And losing illusions hurts. It hurts to realize some relationships were superficial. It hurts to realize some people never truly knew you. And it hurts even more to realize that, in many moments, you didn't truly know yourself either. But here's what transforms all of this into power. This discomfort is not a sign that you are lost, it's a sign that you are finding yourself. Because the more you distance yourself from what is false, the more space you create for what is real. And that completely changes how you connect with the world. You stop seeking validation in shallow places. Stop insisting on connections that drain your energy. Stop trying to fit into environments that require you to shrink who you are. And at the same time, something new begins to emerge. A more grounded inner silence. A more conscious presence. A sense that you no longer need to prove anything to anyone, because you are finally beginning to recognize yourself. But that doesn't mean everything becomes easy. In fact, it can become even more challenging. Because the more conscious you become, the less tolerance you have for what is superficial, manipulative, or inconsistent. And that can distance you from people, environments, and even old versions of your own life. And that distance can feel like loneliness. But it's not the same loneliness as before. Before, you felt alone even surrounded by people. Now, you may be alone for a while, but you are closer to yourself than ever. And that is a difference that changes everything. Because when you become more conscious, more aligned, more whole, your connections change too. They stop being based on need, and start being based on truth. And that can take time. It may require patience. It may require going through a phase where nothing seems to make sense. But it is exactly in that in-between that your real identity begins to solidify. And maybe that's why you've made it this far. Not by chance. Not by coincidence. But because, in some way, you are ready to see more, feel more, and, most importantly, become more. And the further you continue down this path, the more a new perception begins to emerge, almost like a new level of awareness that hasn't yet been fully understood, because if seeing people as they truly are already changes everything, what happens when you begin to see reality itself in a completely different way, as if there is something beyond what you were always taught to see? If you made it this far, it's because, in some way, this video touched something that not everyone can explain, but you felt it. And that already says a lot about the level of awareness you're developing right now. So, if this message resonated with you, if at any moment you saw yourself in these words, consider subscribing to the channel. Because this space is for people going through this awakening, who are beginning to see beyond appearances and want to understand themselves and human behavior more deeply. And I want to hear from you, truly. Comment below, "I'm starting to see," or simply write what you felt while watching this. Sometimes putting it into words is already the first step toward organizing everything that's happening inside you. And if this video brought you clarity, reflection, or even that necessary discomfort, leave a like. It helps this kind of content reach more people who are going through this process but still can't explain what they're experiencing. And if you've realized that something inside you has changed, then the next video might be exactly what you need. Because the more you understand, the more everything starts to make sense. Thank you for staying until the end. I'll see you in the next video.